with all of this instruction, with this template, with take as much context as I can and put it into this inference call. It's a
Right.
lot of information, but then I send it off for inference and I say, create a working draft based on this template. And
Yeah.
then the LLM does its work and it returns a working draft. My average time to first draft has dropped from 2 days to 5 minutes. That's not an exaggeration. Like, it's an AI draft, but all the same, it solves the blank page problem.
Hi, my name is Nick, and I'm the founder of Doctave. Now, this week I'm talking with Manny Silva, who's the head of documentation at Skyflow. Now, Manny has been doing some fascinating work with AI and LLMs in documentation, and we're going to be talking about Verba GPT, which is a system for authoring first drafts of documentation. It's a really impressive system, and we're going to look at how it works and also what the impact was on Manny and his team. If you want to learn more about Doctave, you can find us at doctave.com. We are a documentation platform focusing on docs as code. So we take care of all the doc ops and all the preview environments and so all that kind of setup so that you can focus on just what's important, which of course is your content itself. Now, without further ado, I give you Manny Silva.
Manny Silva, thanks so much for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about kind of LLMs and how they've been important in the last year or so, or in technical writing and the kind of changes they've been making. And you've been doing some really interesting work on this topic. So welcome. I'm really excited to talk about this stuff.
Thanks for having me, Nick. And I like to think that what I've been doing is interesting. I hope others do too.
I'm absolutely sure. I'm absolutely sure. Before we start, maybe could you give a bit of an introduction for yourself, like what kind of work you do, kind of stuff you're
Sure.
into within documentation and outside of it as well?
Of course. So I am Manny Silva, head of documentation at Skyflow. I have been doing tech writing for more years than I would like to count. I have worked at Apple, Google, now at Skyflow. I lead the tech writing team there. And we also handle UX writing. Pretty much anything that involves words that isn't marketing falls under our domain. Um, I also experiment a lot. I'm a tinkerer at heart, and I have done a lot of LLM experimentation, both for Skyflow and outside of Skyflow, but also I am a very strong advocate of docs as tests, which is a strategy for making documentation content testable and verifiable so that we can have confidence in our docs. And to that end, I am the creator and maintainer of Doc Detective, which is an open source and free set of tooling that is intended for tech writers to help you all test your documentation. Outside of the tech writing space, I am a father of three, and I am also a cat dad of four. Um, and I like to garden. I have a server rack in my garage where I run a lot of my own
Very
services. I
cool.
have multiple 3D printers, and I have been doing tabletop gaming like Dungeons and Dragons for the vast majority of my life. So
Nice.
I'm a new nerd.
Well, I'm sure a lot of the listeners here, and myself included, are also in that category pretty strongly. Yeah, no, no, thanks for coming. And yeah, so actually, first of all, we should actually have you back some other time to talk about Doc Detective and Docs as Test, because that's also like a really fascinating topic. So maybe a small teaser for things to come in the future. Yeah. So maybe we could start off just talking a little bit about like how have you actually seen LLMs changing the kind of the documentation and technical writing landscape? I mean, ChatGPT is now like almost 2 years old, if and yeah. So what's changed in your mind?
A lot and also not a lot.
Yes.
Because there are right now where we are in the LLM hype cycle is what I've heard people refer to as the trough of disillusionment,
Yes.
where there was a lot of hype. This is the new magic tool that will solve everyone's problems. That can be applied to everyone's use cases,
Yes.
and it will make all of us redundant and obsolete. And then that's not true. Obviously, it does have impact. It has rather notable impact for a lot of people. I'm not trying to disregard the impact that it has had, but it is not going to replace all of us. In fact, it has pretty minimal well, rather pointed use cases where it excels. And as far as what those are, the lowest hanging fruit for a lot of folks is content reuse. And I'm not saying content reuse in the sense that data folks think of content reuse. It's not single sourcing. It's
Mm.
leveraging existing content and transforming it in some way.
Mm.
So in a like in docs chat or search or that sort of thing. The problem with that is that it's really hard to do well, and it's really, 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 really hard to measure if you're even doing it well in the first place.
Right.
And so a lot of people implement it and think they're off to the races and great, and that they're using AI and they're ahead of the
Yeah.
curve, when in reality, their content is hallucinating a whole bunch and telling people things that aren't true.
Yeah.
Um, the other end of use cases are for content authoring. And that hasn't been approached nearly as much because it is substantially harder. Because
Yeah.
LLMs are great at taking existing content and manipulating it. They can't create content from nothing. That's where
Yeah.
hallucinations come from. So being able to
Yeah.
tackle that in a meaningful way is really damn hard.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting how I think been like in the last 2 years, almost every single like C-level executive has kind of woken up to the point of like, oh crap, we actually need to have an AI strategy. And usually one pillar of that is going to be like the documentation side. If your company is producing some sort of documentation, and then the low-hanging fruit is think, okay, we're going to throw like RAG or on top of the search, and then we're going to and it's going to be great. And like now we're doing AI, tick the box. We're an innovative company, and yeah, it's really not that simple necessarily at all. And like you said, it's kind of hard to track the quality metrics of how good those responses actually are in practice. And what I sort of always really, I'm personally a little bit skeptical about that as a use case, at least at current capabilities. One of the reasons is quite simply that you spend all this time, especially as a professional technical writer, like crafting this content and specific paths through that information or through your content, really kind of understanding how people are going to consume it, and then you're going to put this LLM on top of it that's not going to understand any of that, and it's potentially going to hallucinate stuff and really might not even be giving you anything much on top of traditional search that, which we have really great search technologies, and actually
We do.
they can point people in the right direction really, really well. But
So I agree with the vast majority of that. There can be really transformative use cases
yeah,
for AI leveraging docs.
yes,
The typical RAG, or what some people are even starting to call traditional RAG, even though it's less than 2 years old,
yeah,
is a vector-based RAG, which is something
mm,
that I've implemented myself. And again, it's the low-hanging fruit. It can be done very badly, it can be done well, but even when it's done well, okay, first, let's step back and let's define a few things for the folks who are listening to
yes,
this.
very good.
RAG, RAG, stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, which is a really fancy way of saying that when you pass information into an LLM and say, hi, answer this question for me, the system on the back end goes and searches your docs and finds what it thinks are the most related chunks of information and includes those when the information is passed to the LLM. So the LLM, even if it hasn't been trained on your docs, can still infer against information from your docs. Now, the tricky part with RAG setups is that bit of how does the system know what is most related to the user's question? And that's where vector-based RAGs look like they excel at first, but actually very quickly fall behind because they
Hmm.
use what's called semantic search. If the user asks, how do I create a service account? Then, just to pluck something out of thin air, then the LLM I'm sorry, the RAG system takes how do I create a service account and looks for strings or chunks of content that are semantically similar. So it's going to find all these chunks from your documentation that match service account and how do I use or how do I create? And then it will return the highest ranked results. But that doesn't help if you have different kinds of service accounts. It doesn't
Mm.
help if there are different products that have different service accounts. It doesn't help if there's additional information that's needed and the LLM doesn't have or RAG system don't have access to. It doesn't help if you don't have service accounts in the first place and someone's asking
Yeah.
a question that's not going to get any results.
Mm-hmm.
And so the systems don't know what they don't know
Yeah.
is the problem.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
what ends up happening is hallucinations. The LLM doesn't have the information to work on, even though you have this RAG system in place. And so it makes stuff up
Yeah.
and it gives
Yeah.
wrong answers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think the kind of the hello world of docs rag is usually not enough for you to actually like productionize and get good results out of it. I mean, what was really interesting was that a year ago, or actually, yeah, it was a year ago, I believe, Stripe added, like with a lot of fanfare, they added like AI search to their documentation. There's like their CTO was like talking about it on Twitter and all this sort of stuff. And it was there for a couple months, I think, and then it just disappeared unceremoniously. It's recently come back now within the last month or two, I believe, after a bit of a hiatus. But I think it just shows that if you really want to do this well, like even a company with the docs team that Stripe has and like really the engineering know-how and the resources that they have, even for them, it took a while to actually figure out how to do this well enough for them to feel confident to put it into their into production. And I think my favorite fact is that the one company actually that still hasn't done RAG for their docs is OpenAI itself. And which you know, I find that kind of interesting, at least as a data point.
Oh, I agree. I agree. You would think that they of all people would jump on that bandwagon, but no. I mean, interestingly, they do RAG in their product.
Right.
ChatGPT has RAG built in. When you
Right.
upload a document on the back end, ChatGPT is doing RAG against your document to better inform its answers. It's not training on your docs.
Yeah.
So they 100% have the capability. I mean, everybody has the
Absolutely.
capability nowadays.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting that they haven't done it. I agree.
Yeah. For
Uh,
sure. For sure. Yeah. But
Now, there
oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
are just two things I wanted to touch on really briefly before we move on. So there
Sure.
is a different kind of RAG.
Mm.
It's called graph-based RAG.
Hmm.
And the CCMS and DITA folks are going to be doing happy dances here in a moment because essentially what it lets you do is take a knowledge graph, which can be based on the entity relationships you've already established in DITA workflows and that sort of thing, to be able to let the LLM and RAG system say, oh, hey, there's, going back to the example, a service account, what's related to a service account, and traverse the knowledge graph and then use that information to fetch more information from the vector search so that it can make
Right.
more responses. And that increases things. And there
Mm.
are formal ways of measuring RAG results like RAGAS, RAGAS, for those who are more data science inclined.
Right.
So there are ways of doing this well. And there is the transformative use case of it, which I have experienced with Doc Detective docs myself.
Mm.
So I recently just added AI search and chat, uh, which is RAG based. Shout out to Inkeep, who very generously are sponsoring that for us.
Yep.
But I can give it, I can say, hey, create a Doc Detective test for this chunk of content, and then it does, and it's able to operate over it with all of the knowledge of the docs, and it writes valid Doc Detective tests. So that's what I consider a transformative, not just regurgitate what I've told you
Yeah.
sort of experience.
That's really, really cool. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Should we move on to the actual authoring side, which is actually the thing that sort of prompted this conversation in the first place? A few months ago, your team at Skyflow wrote a really interesting article about Verba GPT. Could you maybe kind of talk about the background there and what exactly you're trying to solve with it?
I'd love to. So I want to start by saying the Verba GPT that I built is internal to Skyflow. We have not published and will not be publishing any code for it. And we are not the same as another Verba GPT that might show up in search results
The one that I
elsewhere.
accidentally went to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, unrelated projects, unfortunate naming conflict.
Indeed.
Now that the disclaimers aside,
Yep.
uh, Verba GPT for me was a way of saying, hey, this AI stuff is here and it's here to stay. This was about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, somewhere in that time frame, right when LangChain first came out.
Right.
And I was like, I need to do something about this. And, no one else has been building stuff on this yet. And this requires my documentation to function. So I don't care that documentation is not traditionally seen as an engineering function. It requires my docs, therefore it is mine. And I claimed it and I ran with it. And no one challenged me. So that worked out. Um, but the reason for it wasn't just to do something with a shiny new tool. There were plenty of people who were doing that, and that doesn't interest me. I needed to solve the problem of I have a really small team. It's me and one dedicated writer. And there are a lot more engineers than us, and it's not the same sort of crazy ratios that you have at like Google, where the tech writers are just so severely outnumbered, like 400 to 1. Um, but all the same, it's hard when you're trying to move fast but still produce good and accurate content. I
Sure.
I thought about I thought, hey, if this can create content, are there ways that I can mitigate the issues with its content creation so that it can help us draft content that is accurate faster than we do today? And so that's the goal that I went into with. And I think I succeeded pretty well considering we've been using it internally for a year on a daily basis.
That's really cool. Yeah. It's funny. I think there's probably not a single tech writer in the world who's who doesn't have enough stuff to do at work. But this is really cool. What you essentially built is a system that uses like these new LLM technologies to then help you produce at least first drafts of content that you're going to be then publishing into production into your doc set.
Yes. So, and let me explain a bit about how this all works, what some of the
Yeah.
underlying pieces are, because there are a decent number of moving parts, but there have to be for a system like this.
Sure.
So first, there's my documentation, all of our public-facing docs, all of our white papers, all of our blog posts. I take all of those and I create a vector database out of them. That's its own process that involves converting as much as I can into Markdown, which is our source format for our documentation in the first place. And then I split the Markdown into chunks. The reason for that is you can't be returning entire pages of context to shove into an LLM. LLMs have limited context windows. And you don't want to return information that isn't meaningful to the user's request, because that also introduces other errors. You want as meaningful of chunks of content as you can get.
Right.
So I split that content, all of my docs, into chunks, and then I turn them into vectors using an embedding model and store those vectors into the vector database. The vectors, for those interested, are numerical relationships of one chunk of text to another. You really don't need to understand any more than that.
Yeah.
But it's just numerical representations of the text. Shove that into a vector database. Then I've got this nice fancy vector database that I can query, and I can just pass in some text and it will return a result. That's the heart of my RAG strategy. Again, I built this a
Right.
year and a half ago. Graph-based RAG wasn't around then. I haven't gotten around to implementing it yet,
Yeah.
but it does the trick for now. this isn't user facing or external user facing. So,
Yeah.
there's also way there. But so that's one thing. So that's how I get my vector database. Now, what happens is there are two ways that internal users can interact with Verba GPT.
Mhm.
And I built a UI in Streamlit so somebody can access it via web browser, and it presents a chat interface. On the left panel, there are a whole bunch of different toggles that I let them flip to change behaviors, but generally, just like you have with ChatGPT and pretty much everything else nowadays, there's a little chat box and then it shows the chat history. And what happens is if somebody chats with it, then the flow is like this. They send in, how do I create a service account? And then that passes through to the orchestration layer, as I think of it. It passes into LangChain and some custom Python that I wrote. And then that goes and takes that query and it queries the vector database and returns my search results.
Mhm.
So I have their information, their initial question, supplemental information, and I pass that off to the LLM. The LLM takes all that information and responds, and I show it to the user. It's pretty straightforward as far as
Yeah.
LLM use cases go. Where things get interesting for chat use cases is via Streamlit, I am able to let users upload arbitrary documents. So they can upload a Word doc, they can upload a spreadsheet, they can upload whatever. And then all of that gets passed along in addition to whatever search results we got from the
Mhm.
RAG, essentially on the fly, creating a vector store that
Yeah.
I'm then querying. And so that's additional information. So if someone wants to chat against additional docs, plus all of the Skyflow docs, they can. But drafting is where it's at with VerbaGPT, because what
Right.
happens is you can flip it to draft mode. And draft mode lets you specify templates and upload, and it requires that you upload additional documents. And what ends up happening is, let's say I have a new feature that I am developing documentation for, and I'm just gonna keep going on service accounts because we're here. So we are introducing service accounts, and I need to write some new docs for it. I
Wow.
have a product requirements document that was written and reviewed and vetted by PM. I have an engineering design document that was written, reviewed by and approved, and I have an API design document. Cool. These
Right.
are three known good documents that any tech writer would have to do their writing anyways. Um, I can go to VerbaGPT, upload all three of these documents, say, hello, I would like to, I'm going to choose this conceptual overview template that I've already defined. And give it a little bit of additional instruction on how I want it to handle the uploaded documents and hit go.
Mhm.
What happens behind the scenes is, unlike, well, it takes the template itself, which I adapted from the Good Docs Project's templates. If you haven't heard of the Good Docs Project, they are absolutely wonderful. Please go and support them however you might.
Mhm.
They have templates and usage guides for those templates that are open source and publicly available. So I took the templates, I took the guides, and I smushed them together
Yeah.
into something that works well for inference. So for within the template, it has all sorts of, not just the structure, but how to use each section and placeholders and examples for each section.
Right.
So that gets passed in for, in this example, a conceptual overview. Then I do query the RAG system to get whatever information we might have that would be useful to include. Then I take all of the uploaded documents, and I mean absolutely all of them. I'm not taking just chunks this
Right.
time.
Yeah.
And then I say, cool, with all of this instruction, with this template, with take as much context as I can and put it into this inference call. It's a
Right.
lot of information, but then I send it off for inference and I say, create a working draft based on this template using the context provided. And then the LLM does its work and it returns a working draft. And if there's more context that I haven't considered yet, I take the next most amount and I say, instead of create a working draft, update this working draft according to the
Right.
template based on the uploaded or the provided context. And then it keeps looping and looping and looping until it's considered everything. It has a draft that matches the template that I provided,
Mhm.
and I have something to begin editing.
That's
It,
awesome. Yeah. No.
it's a lot,
The, yeah.
but
No, yeah. I mean, there's obviously a lot of moving pieces here, which is understandable because there are like just fundamentally like there's a lot of information being pulled in. But I think this is just like fun, like super cool because yeah, we like in the beginning of this discussion we talked about like using the case of using LLMs for essentially reading or consuming a documentation. But the problem is like, of course, when you need to write the documentation, the LLM has no idea about how your product works, and like a big part of big part of the job of actually documenting a system is actually understanding how something works and gathering all that information, and so that you know what you're going to have to write. So what you're doing here is essentially taking all of these product requirement docs and like with through in the system, giving the LLM the ability and the possibility of actually then producing a decent, taking a good stab at actually writing that first draft. And what I think is also like critically important in this use case is that the person who is consuming those drafts is an expert in the system themselves, so that's being documented. Unlike the reader who might be coming to your doc site and asking the LLM how these accounts work, they actually don't know when the LLM might be not spewing nonsense. But you, as a user of VerbaGPT, you understand how this works and how the product works. So you're able to then make the decision to and determine whether or not the LLM is actually being useful or not. But it sounds like in your use case, it has actually been extremely useful and it has saved you a ton of time, right?
oh yes, oh yes. My average time to first draft has dropped from 2 days to 5 minutes. That's not an exaggeration. Like it's an AI draft, but all the same, it solves the blank page problem. I don't
Right.
like, obviously I already have templates to work with and that sort of thing, but I cannot overestimate how much mental load it has relieved. But the
Right.
biggest thing for me isn't even my use of it. Because, yeah, I know how the system works, but there are so many people within my organization who use it for different purposes. So,
Mm.
first, I have anyone in Skyflow can contribute to the documentation. We have an open contribution culture. And what VerbaGPT lets people do is if a PM has something that, okay, they're not so confident in using the templates, but they have a PRD that they want to give a go, then cool. They just put in their PRD and they select their template and they generate, and then they can review it because they're the ones writing the PRD. It's like, well, is that quite how I want it to be? No, let me think about this a different way.
Right.
Or an engineer who might not be as confident in their writing ability
Right.
is able to go in and say, great, I want to help contribute. This is a problem. Let me chat with VerbaGPT and let me draft this that I know
Mm.
is going to be conforming to the structure and is going to, give me more confidence in the quality of the output. And
Right.
so, and then the engineer themselves can review it for accuracy because they're the ones writing the feature, coding the feature. And so, what I've actually ended up doing in many cases is when it's time to draft something new, we put in all of this content, generate this first draft. I don't even review it out the gate. I send it to the
Mm.
engineer and the PM for comprehensiveness and accuracy reviews
Right.
because, and they're able to give me all of the information up front because they have something to work off of. It's
Yeah.
always easier to get someone to point out things that are wrong than to get
Yeah.
information up front.
That's
But then
yeah.
I have all of the information I need to do my editing. And this
Yeah.
is a really, really, really important point. I never, ever trust what comes out of the system,
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah.
It's always a starting point. It
Yeah.
always needs editing. It always needs massaging into the form that I want. That
Mhm.
no one ever trusts the system, and I've made a point that no one ever trusts the system.
Yeah.
It's just, it's not a shortcut. It's just an accelerator.
Yeah.
And as far as acceleration is concerned, actually, one of the most popular use cases for it has nothing to do with external documentation. It has
Mm.
everything to do with internal documentation.
Mm.
Engineers at different times need to create root cause analysis documents when something went
Right.
wrong, and they need to figure out why and what further action items are going to be. And on a good day, that takes the average engineer about 4 hours. That's a lot of time for an
Hmm.
engineer to be working on a document. But what we've
Oh
been
yeah.
able to do with VerbaGPT is I worked with my engineers and I worked with my security team to create a template for our root cause analyses documents. And then we can take a chat log from whatever this issue was. We can take notes
Right.
documents. We can take Jira issues. We can take any artifacts, put them in there and say, based on all of this, output a root cause analysis.
Yeah.
And then it does it. And
Yeah.
the average time that engineers need to spend on these has dropped to 30 minutes.
Mm. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, that's really awesome. But it really shows the importance of being able to feed all of this context from across your organization. And it may come from unexpected places where actually, like, depending on how structured your kind of product design workflow is, a lot of the requirements or feature definitions actually might be in chat logs in Slack and not in some sort of very well formatted Confluence document or some sort of Google Doc where that's being, so being able to sort of pull all this information from maybe slightly unexpected places, and actually, like, what I really love here is that the ability that it's not, these aren't hard coded. You can always just bring your own context as well, whatever it is. It's extremely powerful, I'm sure. And would you also say that because you have these sort of shared templates built into VerbaGPT, it also kind of adds a layer of standardization across the org as well?
100%. It makes it so that when somebody who doesn't normally contribute to the docs decides to contribute to the docs,
Yeah.
then they can, and their contributions will follow our general structural guidance. We do use other tools like Veil to help
Right.
make sure that the content itself adheres to our style
Yep.
preferences.
Big
But
fans of
yes,
Veil. Yeah.
VerbaGPT definitely helps with structure.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome.
There are Well, there's validation. I'm all about validation.
Mm.
And so one of the things that I've considered doing is doing another pass after the working draft is created, that it takes all of the context and it validates that given the subject matter, everything in the context had indeed been considered and applied to the working draft correctly. So it would be an
Interesting.
entire second pass to make sure it got all of the context and that the
Huh.
context was applied appropriately. Again, using that template.
Right.
So letting the LLM self-analyze a little bit.
Mm. Yeah.
And another is making it more agentic. So right now, VerbaGPT is very traditionally coded. Like, yes, we use LLMs, but when you do draft mode and you send a prompt, it follows a very linear pattern. Um, with a looping, but linear all the same.
Sure.
LLM agents are non-linear in that when you have an LLM agent, you give an LLM agency, which is where the tool name comes from, to use different tools that you provided access to.
Mm.
And so, and you let the LLM determine which tools it wants to use or needs to use to best fulfill the request. And what that means is that if I say, how do I create a service account? And it goes and it checks the graph-based RAG, which is another thing I want to build for VerbaGPT. And service accounts don't even exist there. And there's nothing mentioned in the vector-based RAG. Then it's drawing a blank. It can decide, oh, hey, you know what? Actually, I want to go do a search, just an internet search on DuckDuckGo to see what a
Yes.
service account even is.
Yeah.
And then it can get that information, and knowing that where it came from, it can pass that along to the LLM, and it might respond with, oh, hey, Skyflow doesn't have any service accounts, which in fact we do, just for the sake of example.
Yeah.
But this concept doesn't exist in this product. Generally, a service account is XYZ, but you don't have that today.
Yeah.
But agentic behaviors could also get rid of the chat or draft very clear mode distinction I have right now,
Yeah.
so that if I'm interacting with an LLM agent and I'm just asking it questions, it'll just respond via chat. If I say, hey, create XYZ with this template, or create XYZ, it will interpret that and use a draft tool that goes and does all of the linear functionality I've already described and then just returns back
Right.
the working draft that I asked it for. And then it's a much more natural seeming mode of interaction. The difficulty with agents is they're really hard to get right now because they're so new.
Yeah.
But I see agentic LLMs being a big thing in the near future.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think there are like very obvious limitations in LLMs in how they are and in their capabilities today. They're absolutely incredible feats of engineering, and it's kind of amazing that they work in the first place. And but it's going to be interesting to see what, but like right now it's August 2024. We're sort of expecting that GPT-5 is going to come out later this year. I think the capabilities of GPT-5 are sort of going to sort of set the tone for the next 12 months about what can we expect from LLMs and how they're being built today. How far are they going to take us in terms of capabilities? But yeah, I think agentic behavior is going to be an interesting one, because right now, at these sort of GPT-4 levels of capabilities, the agents do tend to sort of lose their train of thought and eventually sort of go into the wilderness. And because you sort of need to be able to like do the right thing over and over and over again and make the right decision all the time without getting lost. And right now, at least, I mean, that's why we don't see that many like just AI agent-based companies being really successful, because the technology is just not quite there yet. But it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next year. And if GPT-5 ends up being a huge jump, I think that's going to, like, that again, we might have to rethink everything. But if GPT-5 is just a modest jump, actually that's going to be almost even more interesting, because it's saying something that we're actually hitting the limits of what we can build right now. So yeah, the next few months actually might end up determining quite a lot about what the next few years are going to look like.
I agree, but also the open source space should not be underestimated right now, because there are so many tools that have come out that allow very small models to compete with
Yes.
GPT Pro.
Yeah.
And on the opposite extreme, we've got Llama 3.1 405B, if I got all those numbers right.
I
That
can't remember
can
them. Yeah.
that it's completely open source and it's a gigantic model, but it goes toe to toe with the
Yeah,
biggest closed source models. And so
absolutely.
the open source space and all of the tooling around it is driving its own set of innovation right now, that I in many cases I can just run all my LLMs on my laptop,
Yeah.
and I don't have to go out
So
to all of the big inference providers, just depending
yeah.
on what I want to do with it.
So, but we haven't added any kind of authoring capabilities into Doctave quite yet. We actually have a desktop app called Doctave Studio, which is sort of the kind of the preview environment and the kind of the authoring environment all encapsulated into this one app. So when you're authoring the documentation with Doctave, um, but actually, like one thing I would love to explore one day is these open source tiny models, being able to fine tune a tiny model that we can actually embed into this desktop app, and just then have a very privacy preserving kind of authoring assistant. So you wouldn't actually even have to send your documentation from your laptop anywhere else, or your product design documents, or things that might actually be sensitive in some cases. It would all say just on the laptop of the author, and you might be able to get a lot of these benefits of something even more kind of more advanced, like Verba GPT, even just locally. But yeah, time will tell. This is not a product announcement or anything like that, but it's an interesting idea that we've sort of been playing around with in Doctave HQ. But yeah, so we'll see how that ends up going. So we're starting to come up on time. So Manny, I want to thank you for coming on. Where can people find you online? And also, I hear a rumor that you're actually working on a book at the moment.
I am. So to answer your first question first, you can find me online at LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active. And some of what you will hear me talking about is docs as tests, which I mentioned at the top of this recording. And that's what I'm writing my book on. I'm writing a book about the theory and application and strategy of docs as tests and how to take your current documentation and gain confidence in it by validating it on an ongoing basis. And this applies to docs as code setups. This applies to CCMS setups. It applies to everything in between. So that's my pet project. That's what I'm writing right now. And there's also the Docs as Tests blog that will provide links, but that has tutorials on how to do Docs as tests in with certain tools and with specific circumstances. But there's also Doc Detective, doc-detective.com, which is the open source tooling intended for tech writers to get into Docs as tests. So there's a lot. You can find me all over the place, but the main location is LinkedIn.
Sounds good. All right, Manny, thanks so much for coming. This was a really interesting conversation. And yeah, we'll have to chat again about Docs as tests sometime as well.
That would be my pleasure, Nick. Thank you for having me.